Why don't we give another enthusiastic hand of applause? I'm going to start with a reading today from Martin Luther King Jr.'s Strength to Love, which inspired my sermon that I'm sharing with you here today. He writes, "We are commanded to love God, not only with our hearts and souls, but also with our minds. Let us consider first the need for a tough mind, characterized by incisive thinking, realistic appraisal, and decisive judgment. The tough mind is sharp and penetrating, breaking through the crusts of legends and myths, and sifting the true from the false. The tough-minded individual is astute and discerning. He has a strong, austere quality that makes for firmness of purpose and solidness of commitment. There is little hope for us until we become tough-minded enough to break loose from the shackles of prejudice, half-truths, and downright ignorance. The shape of the world today does not permit us the luxury of soft-mindedness. A nation or civilization that continues to produce soft-minded men purchases its own spiritual death on an installment plan. But we must not stop at the cultivation of a tough mind. The gospel also demands a tender heart. Tough-mindedness without tender-heartedness is cold and detached, leaving one's life in a perpetual winter devoid of the warmth of spring or the gentle heat of summer. What is more tragic than to see a person who has risen to the disciplined heights of tough-mindedness, but at the same time sunk into a passionless depths of hard-heartedness? The hard-hearted person never truly loves. He engages in a crass utilitarianism, which values other people mainly according to their usefulness to him. The hard-hearted person lacks the capacity for genuine compassion." Why does it require strength to love? Because it is the midnight for our planet, with the Amazon forest being devastated, with species at the brink of extinction, with small continents of litter growing in our oceans, with Annapolis just this fall between flooding and tornadoes being the harbingers of a greater climate devastation. We know we are living on the brink. Why does it require strength to love? Because it is the midnight for our society. From our voting protections being degraded, to white supremacists and ignorant folk having just enough power to tear down the institutions that women and people of color are on the verge of leading, of how we seemingly can't even tell the truth and have accountability when there's an insurrection in our capital. Why does it require strength to love? Because it is the midnight for our spirits, which break every time someone who is seeking asylum dies crossing a desert or swimming across a body of water. It dies every time on that installment plan, every time we use prison to punish instead of a time for redemption through education and compassion and job training. We die slowly every time we don't live our values and part of our psyche breaks. So we need a lot of strength to love these days, but we also need the wisdom to know how to act. And it's that second piece I'm actually going to start with. And that is what King calls tough-mindedness. And he exhorts churches, don't just give them religion, teach them how to think, how to analyze problems, to recognize the pernicious systematic injustices around you, how to read and communicate and inspire, how to figure out how to break down a problem and develop strategies and tactics to address it. If you want to act but don't know how to act, you can't make that possible future real. You need both. And so that's why some of our after-hour programs, like the 8th Principle series, are so critical. That's where we as a community engage in that critical analysis, engage in being able to recognize injustices in the moment, gain practice skills to intercede, to interrupt, to set right. So one of our after-hour tracks is these liberation practices, so we can grow in our capacity to do it for both anti-racism, but also in terms of our environment, in terms of our differing abilities, in terms of gender equality and LGBTQ inclusion and celebration. So I invite you to keep paying attention to those after hours and other information sessions, because we do care about fostering that tough-mindedness that gives us the wisdom how to act. The other way that we really foster this is by helping us learn how to be organizers. Some of my favorite mentors says ministry is just community organizing. You gather people together, you share stories about why and how to act, and you give them a choice. You give them agency so they are empowered to work towards a possibly better future. And we do that with ACT, Anne Arundel Connecting Together, and the UU Legislative Ministries, and like the march on Monday, which you'll all be there, right? Yes, warmth in numbers, right? All of that is learning the wisdom of how to act. In short, another way of understanding that is understanding how to achieve purpose. That's what King says. Power is the ability to achieve purpose. But power isn't neutral. Who is that famous person who said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely? When we are growing our capacity to know how to act, how to achieve purpose, we have to be careful. Because sometimes, if we're not doing that grounded and partnered in love, we achieve power, but it's a power over, not a power with. It's the power to destroy, to create distrust, to tear down, but not power to achieve and create something together. And that's why the love part is so critical. And so, though King says we need both, he spends most of the text talking about love. Because when you're in those midnight hours, and you're brokenhearted, and you're pissed off, and you're rageful, and you just want to scream or lash out, that's when you got to talk about love the most. Love is what helps transform rage into outrage. The love in that midnight hour context that he talks most about shows up as modeled through the life of Jesus. Now, it's no surprise that Martin Luther King Jr. looked to Jesus for his example, but I want to say Jesus is a good example for us too. Because Unitarian Universalists have long said, though we don't say it often, that we don't practice the religion of Jesus as God, but we do often try to practice the religion by Jesus, following Jesus' examples as a human being who walked with other human beings on this earth. And the number one thing that King points out about Jesus is that his love often shows up as forgiveness. Forgiveness. And King goes further than I dared to a few months ago. And he said, do you know where forgiveness begins? It begins with the one who was hurt. You do that forgiving. And you do it for two reasons. If you don't forgive, you keep that anger and hurt and pain within you. And it grows and it will break something inside you. King actually studied a great deal of psychology and psychiatrists, and so as you read his books, he'll talk about these psychological studies and how so much of our deep brokenness and trauma comes from the fact that we live in this messed up world, and when we want to be good and kind and generous, and yet we reach these barriers that don't cross, and how the hate and the self-contamination poisons us from the inside. So he says, forgive for yourself, forgive for the benefit to you. But he also says, forgive, so that way we don't produce a cycle where one hurt produces another that leaves the whole world blind. But he says, what kind of forgiveness are we talking about? In society, sometimes we talk about, should we give this person a second chance? Does this person deserve a second chance? Some people say no. Our society's not very forgiving. But some people say yes, a second chance, a chance to show that you've learned that lesson. But 3 strikes and you're out. We even put that into our laws, rounding up people who committed relatively small crimes and locking them away in overcrowded, punishing prisons. What does King point to in the Bible? Jesus said, when asked, one of his disciples asked him, how much should we forgive? And Jesus didn't say 2 times or 3 times. Jesus said 7 times, 70 times. Forgive a person 490 times. Give them that many chances. Which says it's actually not about quantity. It's about quality. It means if you're forgiving a person 490 times, you are practicing forgiveness constantly. Because when you pair that critical mind, that ability to achieve purpose, with that kind of forbearing love, then you're practicing nonviolence. An ability to achieve purpose, to create a possible future without doing more harm in the process. At UUCA, Reverend John and I spend a lot of our time in these services talking about the love portion, the practices of beloved community. Forgiveness and nonviolence were 2 of the themes earlier this fall, and we pick up other ones as it goes forward. So we care about both holding this tough-mindedness and this tender-heartedness. My dear ones, justice without love is reckless and abusive, and love without Justice is sentimental and anemic. Power is at its best when it's love responding to the demands of justice. And justice is at its best when it is correcting all that stands against love. May we together continue to practice being tough-minded and tender-hearted, loving people. The possible future depends upon it. Amen.